Yo, oh no! Hopefully you figure this out and hopefully you come back if you're paying attention. Y'all, oh my gosh, I have no idea what happened. So tell all your friends that somehow that stream went down and I just had to make a new live. So make sure that they all come back in here. Eek, sorry. Oh wait, just a little bit longer. I'm so sorry. No idea what happened. Do you have any questions about Unit 8 that I can answer right now? How do you write a short answer question without too much info? Bestie. Claim evidence reasoning. Answer the question with a claim. Provide specific evidence that supports that claim. Tell me the how, the why, the so what. If it's talking about effects, right? List an effect, give me some evidence that supports, and then tell me this is an effect because this was an effect because. Yeah, I'm just starting Unit 9 because I did Unit 8 and then my stream went out. Yeah, we can really lock in on Unit 9. Duh, that's what I'm doing here. I finished Unit 9 in my class 3 weeks ago. I always try to leave 3 weeks for AP test prep. So, okay, I'm going to do this right now. Let's share our screen. Cool. So hopefully people are coming back. Sorry, I don't know what happened. Let's get into Unit 9. Please ask questions. Anything I can clarify. This is a great time because I know that probably some of your teachers, at least rushed through Unit 9 if they were able to get, through all of it. Yeah, we're going to keep going. So to contextualize our final unit, which is the Cold War in contemporary Europe, well, obviously, World War I and World War II just happened. And guess what? We now have nukes, which is going to drastically change warfare forever. And we're living in an age of anxiety because we had just not one, but 2 existential crises in a couple of decades, which is going to lead to a lot of chaos and confusion about the purpose of life or the purpose of existence. And we call this existentialism. You can think of this as like the age of anxiety 2.0 or the age of anxiety ramped up. The USA and the Soviet Union emerge as the 2 superpowers after World War II. And both of them also have nukes. So when we're looking, oh yeah, this is going to be, I don't want to phrase this. When I'm going through the Cold War, so many things are happening at the exact same time. So I'm breaking it up really into political and social developments. And I'm first going to talk about a little bit about what's going on with the economy and what the Cold War was. But the hard thing about this unit, and I think this is hard for probably every teacher who teaches it, is that, from 1945 to honestly 2016 or even 2001, so much is happening and it's all happening at the same time. And I think it's hard for, what I would suggest you to do after all of this is make a timeline, literally of decades, of like what is happening when, so that you can see that it's all leading to each other and is like new mixing with each other. But first, let's start where I ended, Unit 8, which was talking about this idea of an economic miracle. So the United States emerges as one of the 2 superpowers after World War II because they funded, a lot of military weapons to then go into World War II, and the U.S. was way less affected generally speaking, Hawaii, obviously, Pearl Harbor, but because we were so isolated from what was happening in Asia and in Europe. So the U.S., wanting to show off its power, wanting to show off its influence, wanting to show off that capitalism and democracy were successful, starts to issue this rebuilding plan in Europe called the Marshall Plan, in which the US gives billions of dollars to Western Europe to help stabilize them, also to help promote capitalism, also to help promote democracy. This results in an economic miracle. If you're looking at the effects of World War I, that was disastrous economic crises. Effects of World War II, these European countries were able to rebound really quickly because of US funding in this Marshall Plan. The major political effect of World War II is that the Cold War like immediately starts. We call it a Cold War because there's no direct fighting between the two major superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. This is a war of ideologies. It's a war of beliefs more than anything else. So in the West, we have democracy and capitalism, and in the East, we have communism and totalitarianism. That's really what this whole war is a conflict over, in which system, which ideology is better than the other. That doesn't mean that conflict doesn't play out. If you are looking at this map, we see conflict throughout the Cold War era, so like 1945 to 1991, is breaking out all across the world. And the Soviet Union and the United States are getting involved in these conflicts. Maybe by now you've taken like a US history class and you've learned about the Korean War and the Vietnam War, right? The Soviet Union is trying to spread communism, and the US is like, nah, democracy and capitalism. Like, we're going to fund these wars and like support sides in these wars so that, for the US's case, communism doesn't spread outside of Russia and China. These are sometimes called hot wars or proxy wars or limited wars. It just means that there's conflict happening during this Cold War time period, but it's just not happening directly between the United States and the Soviet Union. Okay, so let's talk about the Cold War itself. It's a war of ideologies, like I said, and the two sides emerge, the West and the East. The West is Western Europe, and the East is Eastern Europe. If we're looking at this map right here, the Soviet Union starts to extend its influence in the East, and it kind of forms this Eastern bloc. Sometimes these are called satellite states. And if you can just associate, like, East is kind of like forcibly with communism and totalitarianism, the West is more with capitalism and democracy. So one of the first things that the West does, including the United States, is it forms NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So this is an alliance of people that agree that if something bad were to happen, everyone else would step in and intervene. In the East, the Soviet Union responds with this with Comecon, which is an economic restructuring plan that kind of unites a lot of these economies together, and the Warsaw Pact, which is their military response to NATO. They're like, well, yeah, you're going to form this military alliance. Cool, we're going to form this military alliance too. There is a literal division that signifies the Cold War, and that is the Berlin Wall. During World War II in 1945, the Yalta Conference happens, in which these Allied powers agreed to split Germany into like essentially like spheres of influence so that Germany can't lead to another war. So eventually what happens is the West becomes just the West, and they're ruled by the West. But in the East, that's controlled by the Soviet Union. Berlin is in the East. So the capital is also split into these 4 zones. And the Berlin Wall is built around West Berlin, because West Berlin is like this like little tiny island of democracy and capitalism in this otherwise Eastern controlled East Germany. So that is a literal symbol of the division between the East and the West. The Iron Curtain is a figurative symbol between the East and the West. And again, if we're just looking at these ideologies are so opposed to each other that Winston Churchill is like, an Iron Curtain has descended upon the continent. Let me say my political cartoon next. And he's saying like the Soviet Union Iron Curtain is casting a shadow on the East, and like they're unable to develop and progress in the way that the West is. And also it just signifies this actual divide between what's going on in the East, especially economically, and what's going on in the West. So Stalin dies. His death is like a wild story, and you should go watch YouTube videos about that or ask your teacher about it the next time you see your teacher, because it is insane. Anyway, Khrushchev is the next guy who comes into power. This is not a picture of Khrushchev. This is a picture of Gorbachev. Khrushchev says, hey, so like maybe Stalin did some bad things, and maybe we should not be like Stalin anymore. So he implements this policy called de-Stalinization, in which he's trying to distance himself from the ruler that came before him, because he was intense. So Khrushchev starts to practice this de-Stalinization. Khrushchev is leader when JFK is president in the United States. The height of the Cold War happens during both of their rules. It happens during the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 1960s. From the 1960s on, I would characterize a lot of the Cold War as entering its détente era. A détente is a lessening of tensions. Like, we got so close to firing nukes at each other in 1961, which would have led to arguably the decimation of the world. And they were like, whoa, okay, that was too close. Let's take a little step back. Let's enter this détente era, this like cooling off of tensions era, which really goes from the 60s until the Soviet Union falls in 1991. The other major leader that you need to know about is Gorbachev. He's the Soviet leader in the 80s. He realizes that the Soviet Union is losing this economic battle against capitalism. And Gorbachev implements these new policies, perestroika and glasnost. You need to know those two, and you need to know the difference of those two, which are both going to open up the Soviet Union to its end. Let me explain how. Perestroika is an economic restructuring plan. So, oh my God, this is embarrassing. Maybe it's not embarrassing. One of my students, back when I was a teacher in Texas, told me the way that she remembered perestroika is she would say to herself, Perry, I done stroika some gold. And she was like, because you're stroiking gold, therefore you know that it's economic restructuring. And that is how I have remembered it since then. So hopefully that helps you. And Gorbachev's perestroika is kind of like a Lenin's new economic policy 2.0 is just another way to think about it. And glasnost is allowing for essentially openness of the press, which also means openness of critique of governments. And both of these things together kind of starts to like peel back the curtain or allow certain new policies to get into Russia. And like once you've opened the door, like it's not going to get shut. So as a result of both of these things, we see a lot of protests rise up in the Eastern Bloc, which will then ultimately contribute to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. So that's like Cold War in general. Here's like the big kind of government things that are happening West and East. Now let's like look specifically at what else governments are trying to do in the West. In the West, in order to prevent the rise of fascism and totalitarianism again, governments look back at Keynes and they're like, actually, maybe government intervention policies could be helpful. This leads to the rise of cradle to grave welfare states, which just means that governments are taking extra steps to make sure that people's basic needs are provided for. The US is also, the US did this during FDR, right? We created Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. It's that same idea. You're trying to care for people in your society. In Europe, it's specifically because they don't want these people to turn to like another fascist or totalitarian leader. And a lot of people are very excited about the welfare state, especially a lot of like lower class people. This is met with more conflict over time because the welfare state, in order for the government to fund things like healthcare or universal education, governments need to tax their citizens a lot. So that led to conflict in the 80s, and that's still leading to conflict nowadays. You could argue like that kind of discussion is happening even in the United States now. A lot of people are like wanting, I'm sure that you've heard like people are arguing like, we want free healthcare, we want free education. In order to do that, we need to tax people more, and that is how the government would pay for that. So that same conflict that we see even now in the US was happening in Europe, and arguably is still happening in Europe and some of these places. While all of this is happening, in the 1950s and 60s, really, we start to see decolonization movements across the world. So World War I led to the collapse of certain European empires, right? Like the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and kind of Germany's building its empire that it was building. After World War II, European imperial powers, based on their imperial lands, their colonies in Africa and Asia, start to give those up. Sometimes by force, sometimes not by force. Wilson's idea of self-determination after World War I really sticks, obviously, with a lot of people in Eastern Europe and in Africa and in Asia. They're like, hey, we don't want, like, why is France ruling over this land in Africa? Like, can we please just rule over ourselves? And a lot of these decolonization or independence movements are going to be influenced by the Cold War in general, right? This is where we see the Soviet Union and the US get involved, trying to intervene in some of these independence movements to force or encourage these newly independent nations to choose democracy and capitalism or totalitarianism and communism. So, right, Vietnam would be a great example of how the Soviet is intervening to their benefit, but a lot of places in Africa, you can see how the US is indirectly supporting to their benefit. Major ones that I would like you to know about, India against Britain, nonviolent. Oh, actually, I think, oh no, this isn't my next slide. India and Britain is nonviolent. Algeria in Africa was a French colony and it was very violent. So if you can know those two examples of like, sometimes it happened peacefully on the Indians' behalf, sometimes it happened violently, that is a great distinction. Okay, while all of this is happening, in the 60s, Nationalism is still rising. This idea, like nationalism, I mean, what a great FRQ. Like a legit nationalism FRQ would be amazing. I know that last year when the DBQ was on fascism, but to have like something about nationalism in the 1800s or 1900s, I would love. Nationalism is happening in the East, especially as the Cold War is progressing. A lot of these Eastern Bloc countries say, hey, Soviet Union, we don't want you to rule over us anymore. Like, we just want to rule over ourselves. So we see uprisings against the Soviet Union, sometimes peacefully, like in Czechoslovakia, and sometimes violently, like in Hungary. In 1991, Soviet Union falls. Arguably, it's because the U.S. just outspent the Soviet Union, and they couldn't keep a hold, on their Eastern Bloc countries anymore, and then they just kind of collapsed. Which is wild to think that I was alive when the Soviet Union was still around, which is insane for me to think about. Okay. Fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. This leads to immediate political changes. Germany unites the band back together. West and East are now reunified. Czechoslovakia parts. And Yugoslavia, which was a united Slavic land, also parts and splits up based on nationalism. So again, all of these are continuations of nationalism. Germany is uniting, Czechoslovakia is parting, Yugoslavia also is parting. And that leads to genocides in Yugoslavia. So Bosnia, the Bosnian genocide, which is essentially between Serbs and Bosniaks, is going to be another example of genocide that happens in like the early 1990s. That's not often talked about. Okay, that was political stuff. Let's talk about more political stuff, but it also deals with the economy this time. We're going to talk about the European Union. The European Union! Okay. 2 world wars just plagued Europe over the course of a couple of decades. How is Europe going to make sure that they prevent another war from happening again? They're going to, over time, economically and politically unite. So Winston Churchill, I forget what decade he's saying this in, but probably in the 30s or 40s, says, hey, Europe, we need to have this United States of Europe, right? The way that we can prevent our collapse again is going to be to politically and economically unite. And that is what ultimately paves the way for the European Union. And I just like to call these my EU acronyms. So GATT was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1947, which is going to lower tariffs among nations who want to trade with each other, which is, again, going to economically help these countries that are recovering from war. The one that you need to start out with knowing is the European Coal and Steel Community, or the ECSC, in 1952. So this links 5 member countries in northwestern Germany. It's the Benelux countries, so Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, and Germany, under a supranational authority, and it unites their coal and steel production together. Why coal and steel? Well, so that we don't build more weapons against each other. So this forcibly unites their economies together in the European coal and steel. This paves the way for the European Economic Community, which is going to, again, create a common market. So you have reduced tariffs across countries in Europe to promote economic well-being for these countries in Western Europe. That will ultimately continue to pave the way for the European Union, which is its political integration, which happens as a result of the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. The EU is formed in 1993. And eventually, some of these EU countries agreed to have a common currency, which is the euro, which officially goes into effect in 1999. The EU has so many asterisks to it, it's insane. But if you know these 4, or I guess the ECSC, the EEC, or the common market, the EU, and the euro, that should be okay for your understanding in this course. But I can go on rants about the EU today. So we now have like a politically and economically unified Europe. The majority of countries in the EU share the euro, not all of them do. But this is going to help integrate these economies. And I mean, Winston Churchill's dream of a United States of Europe really comes to fruition in the European Union. It is met with so many problems nowadays. Great example of a problem that happened in 2016 is that the UK thought, we don't like giving up our sovereignty, giving up our right to rule by having to go through like this European Parliament that oversees the EU. So let's vote to leave the EU. And they did in 2017. And the votes they barely voted to leave. And also not everyone voted, which is a whole separate story we can get into another time. But that's a great example of sovereignty issues, like the right to rule and like the right to have control over your own country that the EU is facing nowadays. Another huge issue is immigration. This is not only internal immigration, so people moving from like maybe poor Eastern European countries that are part of the EU into Western European countries. This is also a result of immigration, external immigration, so coming in from different continents. A lot of the immigrants that are coming into the EU today are from former imperialized lands, and they're like, "Hey, you ruled over us for like 60 years. We speak the same language. Can I now live in your country?" It's not always met very well. Other problems that the EU has faced over time is as a result of that Marshall Plan and as a result of this economic miracle, really in the 1950s, there's this wave of Americanization that comes to Europe. We're talking people are like using washing machines, they're like getting addicted to Coke, they're like watching Hollywood. American cultural influence really starts to take over Europe in the 50s and 60s. And also concomitant with that, that goes hand in hand with that, is the rise in consumerism. Globalization, Americanization, consumerism over time are going to lead to the rise of green parties and sustainable development. So these parties say, hey, maybe we shouldn't just buy things off of Temu all the time. Maybe we should actually like consider the environment and also like recycle more. So those things are rising in Europe in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s as a result of kind of this like unchecked consumerism that happened in the 50s and 60s. Other big social changes. Feminism is finally happening. We have second and third wave feminism in the mid 90s and early 2000s. What this means, women across Europe now have the right to vote. It took some of these countries a long time. Women have more access to education. Women have access to better careers, including careers in politics. Margaret Thatcher is a great example of that. And women now have more access to reproductive freedoms in that birth control and eventually abortion become way more common in Europe by the 1970s. Abortion itself and IVF is also something that eludes consensus across European powers and across people, right? You can see this in the US today, right? Some people are very anti-abortion, some people are very pro-abortion. Like we can't find a common consensus, a common ground on whether these new developments are good or not. And same with IVF. Other social and cultural changes. So a lot of historians today like to think of Europe as a post-Christian continent. Obviously, like Christianity has its roots for sure in Europe and within the Roman Empire and like the beginnings of the papacy. But a lot of these European peoples nowadays are going to be more so like culturally Christian rather than like devout Christian, which is, wild when you think about all those religious wars breaking out across Europe too. So there's like this contrast between secularism, which is again focusing on the world, the here and now, versus like religion. What role does religion have to play in life nowadays? That being said, I also want to talk about how there were certain Protestant pastors, like specifically German Protestant pastors, who were speaking out against the rise of totalitarianism and Nazism in Germany. Honestly, starting in the 1920s and then through the 1940s. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a great example of this. He spoke out against the German Nazi Party and died in a concentration camp. Martin Niemöller is another example. He's the one whose poem you might have read in class or have seen before. It was like, first they came for all of these people, and then they came then they came for me, and there was no one else to stand up for me. So those are examples of Christian responses to totalitarianism because there were Christians who actively stood up and said, this is wrong, this is very bad. Other example of social and cultural changes is the Catholic Church trying to keep up with the times. So they reform, again, at the Second Vatican Council, or as I like to call it, Vatican II, in which they sit down and they're like, hey, the last time we had this major reform was the Counter-Reformation, the Council of Trent. So what if we, like the world is drastically different now in the 20th century, like mid-20th century than it was even 20 or 30 or 50 years ago. So the Catholic Church tries to reform and tries to include a lot more interfaith dialogue. So rather than just them saying this is how it is, they're trying to now like work with other churches or other even people of faith and different religions to just keep up with the times. Also, RIP Pope Francis. Other social and cultural changes, self-expression and subjectivity are still on the rise, right? This idea of existentialism, what does it mean to be alive? Do we have purpose in life? Means that the world is so subjective. We started talking about this at the turn of from the 1800s to the 1900s. with Albert Einstein and with Max Planck and like all of these new scientific theories that prove that the world is unknowable, that continues in the 1900s. We now think like there's so much about the world that we still don't know, and that leads people to express themselves more freely and also kind of see that nuance, that gray area of like what life could be like. A lot of new art starts to satirize the West and satirize consumerism. So this picture right here is a great example of that. This is still happening in the wake of mass production. So consumerism is still on the ride and still on the rise. Civil rights movements are happening across Europe at the same time that they're happening in the United States. So really in the 1960s, 1970s. So this is going to be civil rights in Europe, mainly for like women and the LGBTQ plus community. Excuse me. And in 1968, there are student-led revolutions that break out across Europe, asking for a lot of different things, but essentially like make sure that you're giving younger people more rights, and also maybe we should protect against consumerism. Okay, let me wrap this up and then I'll answer any questions you have. So politically, part one. The US and the Soviet Union go head to head in the Cold War and get involved in foreign countries in order to further their specific ideologies. European countries lost their colonies around the world. In order to bring about peace on the continent, European nations took steps to ally themselves together, ultimately leading to the creation of the European Union and eventually the Euro. And the fall of communism in the Soviet Union led to a redrawing of borders in Eastern Europe, which in some cases led to genocide. Europe today is still facing political challenges from immigration to turmoil over what national sovereignty looks like, while part of the EU to debates over social welfare programs. Oh man, I would love like a European and national identity FRQ. I would love that, because you can talk about like what does it mean to be European nowadays, like especially with the wave of immigrants coming into Europe. We don't share this common faith. We like are very uniquely different in our like specific nationalities. So like, yeah, what does it mean? What is national and European identity today? Even though they're part of this like larger European Union, they're all so fragmented in their different like beliefs and nationalities, but we have this like supranational authority that is trying to unite them. Oh, what a great debate. What a great question. Culturally and economically, women, minorities, and the LGBTQ plus community fight for civil rights. The US's influence on Europe leads to the increasing consumerism and globalization, which is not always received well. New technologies did increase quality of living for many, but it also led to the rise in green parties who urged sustainable development. And I have absolute must-knows on 2 slides because there's so much content from this unit. How mean is it that our final unit of study in AP Euro has 14 topics that I need to teach you? That is the largest unit of any of the units, and it's the last one. College Board, come on, man. All right, questions. If you have any. Hold on, please. Okay. What do we got? I'm not going to redo. What? What do you mean you can't see my screen? I literally says that it's sharing. Oh, y'all, I'm so sorry. Okay. If you have any questions for me right now, can you not see my screen right now? Oh my gosh. No. I don't know what happened. I blame my first live going down. I also blame my computer. I'm sorry. Well, I can like, I mean, if you're listening to me, hopefully that is just going to help you. Okay, I'll do a brief run through. View tab. Okay. I want to make sure that you can still see this, and then I'm going to go back. Okay, hold on. I'm so sorry. All right. Okay, if we're going back. What do I want to highlight? I'll highlight some EU stuff for you. Yeah, I'll start here. Hopefully you can see. Cool. So these are the 4 things that I would want you to know for the EU. GATT, not necessarily. The European Coal and Steel Community, yes. So that's going to link the Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, and Germany together over a supranational authority, so an authority that oversees all five of those countries. It links their coal and steel communities together so that we're not creating weapons. And this paves the way for the economic community, which creates a common market, which means that we now have like this shared economic system that we are all a part of in 1957. And this leads to the EU in 1993. So the EU is now a political integration, whereas these other two were more economic integrations at first. And then the culmination of the economic integration is the euro, which is adopted by most EU countries, but not all EU countries. Okay, I'll do that one. I'll just keep going back a little bit. Oh, man. Okay, I'll just start at the beginning. I'm going to go real fast. Grab your phone, take pictures. Okay. Post-World War II, Marshall Plan, economic miracle. Western Europe's doing great. U.S. is only going to give this to countries that are democratic and capitalist. So you can see in this map right here, they're avoiding countries in the East that are under Soviet control. Cold War, no direct fighting between the Soviet Union and the U.S., indirect fighting in these proxy wars or these hot wars around the world, especially as a lot of these countries are fighting for independence. Political developments. We got the West. We have NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In the East, we have the Warsaw Pact and Comecon. Comecon is literally an economic alliance of Eastern Soviet, like Eastern Bloc countries, countries under the control of the Soviet Union. Warsaw Pact is a military alliance. Iron Curtain. Berlin Wall. Decolonization. Perestroika Glasnost. Leads to the crumbling of the Soviet Union. Main events to contextualize the Cold War, y'all, like World War I, World War II, nuclear weapons, new technology, age of anxiety. If you're not following me on Instagram, again, I'm just going to point out like my European, like my encyclopedia that I'm posting every day. Essentially, the first page that I have for you is a great example of contextualization. Those are all like I have like my picture, my face, whatever, and how many days till the exam. Then as soon as you swipe, it shows you. I'm absolutely contextualizing the topic at the top. So make sure that you read through all of this. Okay. Cradle to grave welfare state. Yeah. So European states, European countries after World War II are like, hey, maybe we do actually need to intervene economically speaking, because the last time we didn't do that, fascism rose. So this is when European governments are starting to provide more benefits for their citizens. So this could be things like healthcare. This could be things like universal education, or just like some kind of social security net, like we see that happen in the US too, in order to kind of support people from descending into fascism, totalitarianism again. This is met with conflict today because of high taxes. Decolonization movements happen in the 60s. Soviet Union and the US get involved in a lot of these. Some are violent, some are not violent. Nationalism is still happening in the East. So in that Soviet Union, like that Eastern bloc of countries, people are not happy to be part of the Soviet Union. So they try to revolt against the Soviet Union. We see this peacefully in Czechoslovakia, violently in Hungary. Soviet Union falls in 91. Political changes, Germany unites, Czechoslovakia parts, Yugoslavia also parts, which leads to lots of genocides. So again, this is a continuation of that nationalism theme. Just talked about the EU, modern day issues in the EU, feminism. Great, that's all. I ran through everything. Here's some pictures. Take pictures of this. Do you need me to repeat any of these things before I go into the next one? Four, three, two, one. Okay, next one. There we go. And these are all things that are listed by name in the course exam description. Glasnost is Gorbachev's policy of openness. So people are now essentially able to have more freedom of the press, which is going to lead to more critics of the Soviet Union, which is going to lead to its collapse. Gorbachev just did I would just know him for perestroika, economic restructuring. So realizing that the communism is failing in the Soviet Union and that he needs to institute some new economic changes. So that's what glasnost is, or sorry, perestroika is. And then glasnost is that openness or freedom of the press. Anything else? Cradle to grave, diapers to dentures, birth to death, welfare program. So you're supporting people throughout their whole life. Baby boom is after World War II. So literally, like if you think about the generations of soldiers who are coming home, like I don't know how old your parents are. My parents are boomers. They were all born in like the mid 50s. Like I guess honestly, like mid 40s to mid 50s is going to be that baby boom. Oh, artistic movements. Oh, I don't have any in here. Yeah, so we start to see during early 1900s, abstract expressionism is this idea that now things don't have to be beautiful anymore. I mentioned this in my last slide. When you think about the romantic movement, all of those paintings are like beautiful to look at. When the universe becomes unknowable, when people think maybe we can just express ourselves in the way that we want and it doesn't have to be pretty, that's the rise of like abstract expressionism, which means that like you can just in unique ways express how you feel. That is continuing on into art in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So postmodernism is just kind of like weird modern art that doesn't make sense to a lot of people. Age of anxiety is due not only to nuclear war, because it actually starts to happen in the early 1900s. So prior to nukes being developed, age of anxiety, I would say, really kicks off after World War One, because you'd never seen conflict, you'd never seen crisis like that before, and it just brought. I mean, the whole world was impacted by World War One. So people are like, what is the purpose of everything? And that leads to that age of anxiety. Vatican II is the Second Vatican Council. Catholic Church tries to reform to keep up with the times in the late 1900s. Was France more conservative or liberal during the Cold War? I don't actually know. I never really focused on France during the Cold War. Leonid Brezhnev. Leonid Brezhnev is a Soviet leader that I did not talk about at all, so I'm glad that you know that. Oh, Keith, you're right. So yeah, you could argue that the age of anxiety starts when the universe is proved to be unknowable. So yeah, like early 1900s, but I would say like definitely continues after World War One, and then like really ramps up after nuclear warfare. ECSC, European Coal and Steel Community. Can I go over enlightened absolutism? No, you can go watch my live from period 2. Yeah. Ooh, fascism and totalitarianism, sure. Totalitarianism means that one person has total power. It's like extreme absolutism. Extreme absolutism. Because remember, with absolutism, the absolute monarch is still trying to keep the nobles happy by giving them certain privileges. In totalitarianism, Stalin could do literally whatever he wanted to do. And he didn't care about other people when he was doing that. He wasn't caring about supporting the people who were working for him because he ruled through such fear and terror. Fascism is extreme nationalism. So it is extreme loyalty to the state that is often culminated or characterized in one single charismatic leader. So Hitler and Mussolini would be fascists, right? When you think about Nazi Germany, you think about Hitler. Like he is the kind of the culmination of those fascist, those Nazi beliefs. The same thing with Mussolini in Italy. Gorbachev led to the fall of the Soviet Union. I love that y'all are answering each other's questions. Are the economic development during this period getting better after the dissolve vehemently of the Marshall Plan or no? I don't know what that means. Is Mussolini really important? Well, your DBQ, 2024 DBQ, was about fascism being a traditional or something else movement in Italy during World War II. So you will show up for sure on the test. I think more of your teachers probably focus on Hitler more so, which is fine because if you know one of them, you could use them as appropriate examples in your FRQs. Why did the Soviet Union not collapse earlier? Literally because it was hanging on. Like literally because it was hanging on. And then as time progresses, and as like again, the US outspent the Soviet Union. If you're looking at the space race or the arms race, the US is proving over and over again that they have the money to do all of these things. The Soviet Union is trying to keep up to make communism look good, and they can't. And when Gorbachev introduces his glasnost and perestroika, that's going to lead to people allowing people to start to critique the Soviet Union and its government. That leads to the rise of revolutions. We see a really clear one in Poland under Lech Wałęsa's Solidarity movement, which is supported by Pope John Paul II, because he was Polish. So all of these movements then start to really take over in the Eastern Bloc, which is ultimately going to lead to the independence of those Eastern Bloc countries and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Are the economic developments during this period getting better or worse after the Marshall Plan went away? I mean, the Marshall Plan like kickstarted their rebirth. Like that was that economic miracle that allows a lot of these countries to then enact new economic policies. So were they better or worse? That's kind of debatable. Is a little bit debatable based on how you feel about cradle to grave social welfare programs and whether you think a government's responsibility is to support the people in their civilization, in their state. Or if people's individual economic sovereignty supersedes the government caring for people within that society. Did the war in Afghanistan significantly contribute to the fall of the Soviet Union, like the Soviet-Afghan War? I mean, you could argue again because wars are expensive. So, like, the more money the Soviet Union is spending, the more conflicts that they're going to have, especially as time progresses. Wasn't that in '79 though? So I would say that wouldn't be. Was it in '79? I should know the answer to that. I would say that might be a little bit outside of the time period. Pop art is postmodernism. Like postmodernism, you can think of as like an umbrella term. Pop art fits into that. Um, a lot of like architectural movements fit into that too. Yeah, my FRQs, y'all, I have. Let me say something right now that is going to be very helpful. When you're looking at your free response questions, actually, let me see if I can just pull this up and that it will actually work. I'm going to give you a little insight into what I'm only giving to certain students tomorrow in my last and final live, but because y'all have consistently come to some of these, let me show it to you if I can find it. Writing lab. Actually, shoot, it's not here. Hold on. It's on a different tab. One moment. This is going to be helpful, I promise. It's going to be worth the wait. Hopefully you're just answering your questions away while I'm not looking at the chat. How are we studying? Are you using resources? Are you just using lives? Are you watching other videos? Number one study strategy is to get in a group together and talk it out, because if you can talk it out loud, that's going to be so helpful. Share. Don't also, y'all, I hate Quizlet. Do it by hand. I'm just assuming that someone is saying Quizlet right now. Okay, let's do this. All right. Once it loads. Don't worry, it's not about the Cold War. Here we go. All right. Questions. Can we see this? When you're looking at your free response questions, your short answer question, your first one is going to be a secondary source from the time period 1600 to 2001. Your second one is going to be a primary source from 1600 to 2001. And your third one, which is not going to have a stimulus, you will either choose the time period. First one will be 1450 to 1815. Second one will be 1850 to 2001. Your DBQ will only cover content from 1600 to 2001. Your LEQ, remember, you have three options, will either be 1450 to 1700, 1648 to 1914, or 1815 to 2001. What years should you study the most? Like, if we're going to be strategic about if we're going to be strategic about studying, which I guess you could argue is a struggle, you really need to highlight and focus on 1600 to 2001. Because if you do that, you'll be able to for sure get 3 of the SAQs and your DBQ and 1 LEQ. Also, looking at this, things from 1450 to 1600 aren't really going to show up, which means that on your free response questions, Protestant Reformation, its effects might show up, like the Reformation itself. Like anything, I mean, you can colonization in the Americas, probably not going to show up. So make sure that you pay attention to this and use this to help guide your studying, because the free response portion of your test, your SAQ, DBQ, and LEQ collectively are 60% of your overall grade. Your multiple choice is only 40%. There are for sure going to be multiple versions of your test. There were multiple versions of your test last year. There are going to be at least 2. You will only write 1 LEQ. 3 SAQs, 1 DBQ, 1 LEQ. If I were to take on one main thing away from Unit 9, what would it be if you were to able to summarize it in a few words? Ooh. I have this summarized. I'm going to summarize it in 5 sentences for you. Kim. There we go. Ooh, I'm going to make you do a little bit of the work, though. So like I have this thing called the Ultimate Review Packet, and it teaches you everything that you need to know for the content. And then I also have this thing called the Ultimate Exam Slayer, which also lets you put all that content knowledge to the test, because it sets up a blue book-esque style, but not College Board approved or AP approved model of like the testing system. And I have questions for literally every single unit. I have free response questions, multiple choice questions for every single unit, so many of them, and explanations. So you can go check that out. Ultimate Review Packet, Ultimate Exam Slayer. You just Google it. If you just Google my name, it'll pop up. So big picture, like this is an example of a study guide that I have that goes along with my Unit 9 study video, which is not on YouTube because it's only for my Ultimate Review Packet subscribers. But here's like things that I have, right? As World War II ends, the Cold War began, which pitted Western democratic capitalist nations against Eastern totalitarian communist nations. After World War II, decolonization occurred, in which former European colonial landholdings in Africa and Asia fought for independence, self-determination, any of those things work. In order to prevent further war, European states took steps toward political and economic integration, which eventually culminated in the creation of the European Union in 1992. European Union faces challenges today from increased immigration from Northern Africa and Southwest Asia, as well as challenges to national sovereignty like Brexit. Rampant social changes occurred in Europe from the creation of social welfare programs in order to support societies in the post-war world, as well as an increasing consumer culture due to globalization. And those would be my 5 sentences that would really wrap up Unit 9. Hi, Miss Z. Shout out. Layla loves you. Okay, I'm assuming y'all are all doing other things at this point. So go do your other fun lives together unless you have questions for me. I'll stay on for like another 10 minutes if you have any questions. If you don't know the topic, how do you score any point or unsure of the time things were made? Besties, that's what studying is for. At some point, you gotta just like, what I would do, I think the most helpful way to study is in groups. And I think the most helpful way to study is making a timeline. Make a timeline of those 4 time periods in the course, right? 1450 to 1648, 1648 to 1815, 1815, 1914, 1914 present. And then literally decade by decade, talk about the major events that are happening, just so that you can visually see that a lot of the stuff is happening at the same time. If we were to talk about Brexit, which happened in 2016 on an LEQ that ranges to 2001, will it count for anything? That's a really great question. It kind of depends on what the topic is. Like if the whole question is like, what are modern day issues faced by the EU? That seems like a very appropriate thing to talk about, especially because Brexit is listed as an illustrative example in the course exam descriptions. Like Brexit is something that we're encouraged to talk about in our classes. Could you really quickly run down World War II, World War I, World War II, and the Cold War? No. Can we talk about the Moroccan crises? Sure. Essentially, like Britain was was stirring up some conflict in Morocco for the indigenous Moroccans against France because Britain was trying to weaken France's influence in Africa because imperialism and nationalism. This is in like the early 1900s, so the lead up to World War I. And it is ultimately unsuccessful because France keeps Morocco. For the Unit A live review, just because I had to switch over to this so quickly, I'm going to see what was going on with that, and then I'll make sure it gets posted. Okay. If you have any more questions, ask me. Otherwise, follow me on Instagram, follow me on TikTok. I will probably make little TikTok videos about any questions people have to ask me over the course of the next 5 days. But also, you need to study. You can't just rely on me to do thinking for you. I've graduated from high school. I know all the things about European history. You don't. You need to study. Yalta Conference is the division, the agreement by Western powers. So the agreement by the Big Four, which is going to be France, Britain, France, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, to split Germany into occupied zones after after World War II ends. In what ways did the Treaty of Versailles shape interwar Europe? Economic crises, humiliation of Germany. Anything else? Okay, go follow Lucas and his cute little Google Meet code that he sent out. Have a great time. Study everything together. Y'all are the best. Best of luck. As I always tell my students, you can do it. I believe in you. Okay. Bye-bye.